I want to speak about the media coverage of fracking in the Karoo, or shale gas drilling as it's more properly known. Now, I'm a columnist, right? I'm not a primary reporter. I write opinion. Now, to do that, I like to be able to rely on the media for information on the issues that I explore in my columns. I need competent reporting by journalists with feet on the ground to write what I do. Given facts, as best as I can determine them, I then place them in the context of history, economics, science, and so on, to form an opinion. Too often, however, that means debunking bad statistics, propaganda, exaggeration, and not only on the part of companies or governments or lobby groups, but often on the part of the media itself. And I do this because I think it's important for the media to get it right when it takes part in public policy debates. In early 2011, someone asked me what I thought about fracking in the Karoo, and I wish I could remember who that was, because I want to give them a Troll of the Decade award. My initial answer was to defer judgment until I'd researched the subject, but my first instinct was to give the benefit of the doubt to those who opposed shale gas drilling. You see, the media hadn't been very kind about the proposals by several oil and gas companies to explore the Karoo for natural gas. Gas drilling, said an adventure sportsman named Lewis Pugh, would destroy the Karoo. It would poison our drinking water. It would dishonor those who died for our freedom. We had a moral choice, he said, between water and gas, between good and evil. And our constitution was at risk of being shredded by greedy oil companies. Like the Madibas and the Mahatmas of yesteryear, we had to fight this. Now, such emotive rhetoric makes me very suspicious. Right, whenever I hear something that is too good to be true, I disbelieve it. And the same goes for something that is too scary for words. So I started researching some of these claims because while the anti-fracking guys, the Treasure the Karoo Action Group, say that a developing country like ours can't afford corporate tyranny, I believe that a developing country like ours can't afford to sacrifice its economic future to the exaggerations of environmentalists, no matter how passionate and well-intended they are. Unfortunately, what I found was a media that was, to a large degree, in hock to the environmental lobby. Either they agreed, they were very sympathetic, or they were themselves environmental activists. Some of them even admitted to being funded by green lobby groups. Lewis Pugh had reason to be thankful to the media. Now imagine if someone like Shell wrote something like that about me, or worse, paid me. Right? I'd fully expect my credibility and my career to be over. But apparently such qualms don't bother all journalists. This isn't how public opinion or government policy ought to get made. We can't afford to be sold down the river of either corporate interests or activist causes. Now, I trust neither Shell nor the Treasure the Karoo Action Group, but because everyone, including the media, was already on Shell's case, examining the claims of the opponents to hydraulic fracturing was a field wide open for my brand of journalism. And that's what I did. And I want to show you two case studies of how the media took the sensationalist bait and ran with it without first asking the right questions. In doing so, I'm going to skip over a lot of issues around fracking. It's a very big subject, like the fact that burning tap water actually predates shale gas drilling. That scenes purporting to show what the Karoo will look like actually represent an entirely different sort of gas field in Wyoming. Or that water pollution claims keep getting debunked by regulatory agencies long after the media made a big splash about the original allegations, often made by litigants in lawsuits who get very upset when regulators tell them that actually their water is just fine to drink. The first I want to look at is an infamous paper published by scientists at Cornell University. It claims that because of methane leaks during production and transport, using gas to produce electricity is actually worse for climate change than coal. The authors of the paper, Robert Howarth and Tony Ingraffia, are well known in the environmental circuit. They talk about the dangers of industrial development. Now, that doesn't make them wrong necessarily, but it should raise enough suspicion for a journalist to dig a little bit deeper. What they did was they tried to take an inventory of what they call fugitive methane. They arrived at a figure, they picked a global warming potential number, and they used that to claim that gas is worse than coal, despite the fact that it obviously burns much cleaner. And the media duly reported the study, right, and its sensational findings. But what does one find when one digs into the Howarth and Ingraffia study? Well, let's start by listening to the authors themselves. This is from a presentation that they gave to their own colleagues. They say they're limited data. These are not published data. These are things teased apart out of PowerPoint presentations here and there. They said a lot of the data we used are really low quality. Right? They said the quality of the data behind that number, methane emissions during well completion, are pretty lousy. You know, they're these weird PowerPoint sort of things. And then they said, we don't intend for you to accept that what we've reported on today is the definitive scientific study in respect to the question. Clearly it is not. I hope you don't gather from this presentation that you think we're right. We did not look as carefully at coal, but I'm sure they are lower than natural gas. And the last one, you can get any answer you want based on modeling and assumptions. That's the authors of the study themselves. Now let's go to some of the other scientists. Francis O'Sullivan says the use of flaring and reduced emissions completions reduced the levels of actual fugitive emissions from shale well completion operations to substantially lower than several widely quoted, that is Howarth's, estimates. Lawrence Cathels from the same university said there's no evidence that gas is being vented directly into the atmosphere at rates that could justify their conclusion. Their analysis is seriously flawed. Paula Jaramillo, we don't think they're using credible data, and some of the assumptions they're making are biased. The recent Howarth estimates of methane emissions are dramatically overstated. It would be unwise to use them as a basis for policy making. Dan Lassoff from the National Resource Defence Council, while I can see an argument for using a time horizon shorter than 100 years, I personally believe that the 20-year global warming potential is too short a period to be appropriate for policy analysis. Now, the National Resource Defence Council is an environmental lobby group that was among the study's funders and also opposes shale gas drilling. This paper is selective in its use of some very questionable data and too readily ignores or dismisses available data that would change its conclusions. Dave McCabe, he's an air quality specialist with the Clean Air Task Force. It's a lobby group that opposes all fossil fuels, including natural gas. Now, all of the other studies, without exception, more or less agree with this slide from the US Department of Energy. Right, the key bars are the ones circled in red, showing greenhouse gas emissions from coal and gas respectively. If you read the other scientists, you'll find that what Howarth and Ingraffia did was to quadruple the amount of methane that the gas company's book has lost and unaccounted for. Then they seem to be unaware of the fact that 2/3 of the stuff is used to power pipeline equipment. They ignore that most of the rest gets flared off. Then they use a non-standard global warming potential factor to prove that it's worse than carbon dioxide. At every step of the way, they exaggerate the amount of methane lost to the atmosphere and its impact. And never mind that if you were to consider other pollutants, like mercury, nitrogen oxide, sulfur, and radioactive fly ash, gas almost completely eliminates them when compared with coal. So in short, the Cornell study is utter hogwash. Its own authors say so. Now, the media should have said so before running the sensational headlines about a study that most of them didn't even bother to read, let alone run by other expert sources. This is perhaps the best sort of summary as a verdict on that paper. It's been consigned to the junk heap. Of course, being a skeptic and a journalist, I didn't trust this claim either, so I checked it out. I found the scrap heap. There it is, asserted as undisputed truth, despite the fact that it is universally discredited by scientists and even other green lobby groups, using simple facts that any journalist can grasp. There is simply no excuse for the media in 2013 to still promote what has been reduced to a false lobby group talking point. Yet, there they are, they continue to do so. And here's the problem. Once a wrong fact gets legitimized by media coverage, it is very, very hard to squash. I've got quite a few of these case studies. I wanted to cite the famous Duke studies, which its authors and the media claimed to establish a link between methane contamination in drinking water and shale gas drilling. You see, if you read those papers, you'll find that they establish no causal relationship. They disagree with proper baseline testing, and in any case involve only a non-toxic gas, rather than telltale brines and fracking chemicals. The authors, the reason why this is relevant now is that the authors repeated their 2011 trick a couple of weeks ago, and it was again unquestioningly reported by the media. This was just the other day. Due credit to the Mail and Guardian for getting there first. The thing is, they found not much more, right, and they contradicted their earlier study in important ways. Now, I have no time to go into detail on this one, but consider this an honourable mention for the Duke study. For the second example that I want to go into in a bit more detail, I have a local case. I don't know if any of you remember the infamous U-turn professor. Professor Gerard van Tonder is a hydrogeologist at the Institute of Groundwater Studies at the University of the Free State. He used to be entirely in favour of shale gas drilling. He didn't think it was possible that it could contaminate groundwater. And then one day he changed his mind. Now, scientists do this, right? When they find new information that contradicts what they thought they knew, Right? This is perfectly normal. This is indeed admirable. This is the scientific method at work. However, what scientists should do then is conduct research, perform experiments, do analysis, write up a paper that they then present to their peers for review before publication in a credible academic journal. The Cape Times is not a credible academic journal. And that is not a scientific statement. In an email to me, he actually used the phrase, he's more than 100% sure. Right. Other newspapers quoted the Cape Times and warned of the worst water pollution problem in the world. Right, well, this is heady stuff, right? So I did something radical. I emailed Professor van Tonder. I asked him for a copy of his paper. To my astonishment, I was the only journalist in South Africa who had bothered to ask him for it. Also, he didn't have one. He said he'd gone to the media because of the great urgency of his theory. Right? A week later, I did get a draft. Right? It was a cobbled together, incomplete draft full of quotes from the Wall Street Journal and even a fracking diagram that I'd come across before. I'd actually cited this in my own book as evidence of inaccurate diagramming in the media. It greatly exaggerates the scale of fractures and possible pollution pathways. Anyway, I thought, okay, I'll read this paper. In short, it said that deep brine aquifers near the 4-kilometer deep shale layer exist. They're under pressure, and when faulty well sleeving or natural dolerite intrusions create water migration pathways, the pressure is released, and that deep brine, together with naturally occurring radioactive materials and fracking chemicals, of course, would flow all the way to the surface and contaminate shallow groundwater. It contains some speculative evidence based on hot water springs, even though most of them originate from less than 1,000 meters below ground level, which is well above the likely fracturing zones. And he also had a colorful computer model that illustrated what would happen if his pet theory was correct. But here is the money quote. The model must be viewed as a very rough first attempt based on sparse information which cannot be validated or verified. Does that sound like 100% certainty to you? It didn't to me. Then I performed another amazing feat of journalism, and I spoke to some other scientists about it. Most were pretty scathing, but they wouldn't go on the record because there was no paper to critique. Right, they said they'd wait until he published in a credible academic journal. But here's what the leader of the Karoo Water Expert Group, for whom van Tonder was a concurring reviewer, said. Right, most research team members disagree and are mystified by his U-turn and haste. Eventually, a year later, I got a paper. Well, not a paper as such. It was actually a chapter in a book, which is also hardly a refereed journal. It was a broad summary of a lot of water-related issues around shale gas drilling, but eventually I found a single bullet point on the subject of the newspaper articles of a year before. And that's what it says. There might be possible output migration pathways. This cannot be ruled out. Does that sound like 100% certainty to you? Look, this fellow has a theory. It's an intriguing one. Right? It merits more research. Right? But it did not require a hydrology degree to spot many possible objections to it, point out many uncertainties and inconsistencies, and frankly, poke it full of holes. Right? I did so in 2 columns, which attracted great debate by scientists, including van Tonder and his students, who ended up looking a little bit foolish. Now, perhaps that is too much to ask of an overworked reporter on a daily, right? But is it too much to ask them to just go and ask the guy for a paper, or check a claim with other experts before running sensational headlines? Because the problem is these sort of headlines stick. Right? They become truth. The eventual correction or moderation of the claim never has the same impact. Right. Today, everyone talks about upward flow of deep groundwater in the Karoo and how it will contaminate shallow aquifers. But the truth is, scientists don't even know for sure whether those deep aquifers even exist, right? Let alone whether they're under sufficient pressure to reach the surface. Only research that is presently underway can answer that question. But then who cares when we've read the answer a year ago in the Cape Times? Ladies and gentlemen, shale gas drilling raises important issues that require informed decision making, especially on the part of government. However, the media's approach to the matter is too often disappointingly sensational, shallow, and one-sided. Some journalists, when they're not environmental activists themselves, appear to uncritically accept the claims of environmentalists and treat with scorn any counterclaims by the oil and gas industry. They publish sensational claims by scientists without any context or verification, and don't even bother to read the papers that lend themselves to these grandiose headlines. Granted, to go beyond simple he said, she said sensationalism requires research. Right? It isn't fun to spend your evenings perusing the course material of the International School of Well Drilling. It exists. Or reading dozens of regulatory reports, or studying complex academic papers on shale gas. An independent media, to my mind, is critical to hold the government accountable and to keep the oil companies on their toes. But to be effective, they need to do the homework. Sensationalism, advocacy journalism, lazy research creates a credibility gap that causes government officials to ignore them and forge ahead without them. Watch what happens in the fracking saga. Right? I don't think that the media or the environmentalists have a great deal of influence on that debate anymore. And frankly, I think our democracy will be the poorer for it. For the sake of our environment, our economic future, for wise policy making, and the credibility of the media itself, it's important to get this stuff right. Because remember, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. Right? Winston Churchill said that. You might want to put that on the walls of a newsroom. If only to see how many people spot the fact that the quote is incorrect. It was not said by Winston Churchill, it was said by Mark Twain. Who prefers this attribution? Right, another lesson. If a quote is not dated, disbelieve it. It's probably wrong. If it's attributed to Mark Twain, George Bernard Shaw, or Winston Churchill, check it. Most quotes get attributed to these three guys. You'll be shocked to learn that Mark Twain didn't say it either. An obscure English preacher said it long before Twain. And the Portland Gazette in 1820 had this version. If you read the Examiner on the 9th of November 1710, you'd find these words written by a rather more famous writer. And frankly, Mr. Swift stole it too. Do your homework. Question everything. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. Are there any questions?